It's wonderful to be here in your Sami homeland and in the state of Finland. I have to say that, as you know, Canada is a very big country, very diverse. The part I come from, northern Canada, looks like this, so I feel very much at home here. It's a very familiar looking geography and wonderful to be in the cold. I am speaking to you today as one of 3 commissioners that we had in Canada, and our commission officially completed its work in 2015. However, I can tell you that the ongoing discussion in every sector of society in Canada continues, and we're very pleased and honored for your interest here and in other international places as we share lessons learned from our different experiences. I also, before I get into the content, want to just give regards to you. I know some of you know one of my fellow commissioners, Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild, and some of you have also had the opportunity to meet our chair, Justice Murray Sinclair. These 2 commissioners, both of them are Indigenous Canadians, but if you know Canada and our First Nations structure, there are many First Nations within Canada. So even those 2 men are not from the same Indigenous nation, nor is my husband, who's from a different Indigenous nation in Canada. And so great diversity, but no possibility in Canada to have every group represented. And so I'm going to talk more about the issue of commissioner selection, among other things, because that's one of the potentially very controversial and really critical issues related to functioning of a commission. I myself was born in a non-Indigenous family in southern Canada, but I have lived among the Dene Nation for the past 40 years. So I live in a kind of in-between place, which has been helpful to the work of our commission. I want to today speak to you a little bit about our commission itself, so you have context, offer some lessons learned about commissions themselves as I experienced it, and then some lessons about reconciliation and a few conclusions. And if time allows, I would offer you a very short video so you can hear from some of our young people about the experiences of learning all of this. The historical context, which may or may not apply here, some of it maybe does, but in Canada there's a long tradition predating Confederation of Canada of treaties between Indigenous peoples and the state, and then many treaties that were signed up to and including present day. We also have recognition of Indigenous rights in the Canadian Constitution. I believe that is your case here in Finland as well. And that became very critical to what happened, as I'll tell you. Our TRC focused specifically, and we've heard conversation this morning about the scope and the mandate. Ours was very specific to the issue of residential schools. We had over 150 institutions that were recognized, 150,000 children who went through them, and they operated, not all of them at the same time, but over the course of almost 150 years. There were residential schools in Canada before Canada became officially a country. So a very long history, many generations of children being in the schools. The next bullet about the court case is very important because unlike most truth commissions in the world that we've heard about so far, ours was not a political commitment to hold a truth commission. It was a legal obligation. There was a massive court case, and it was brought by 80,000 living survivors of the residential schools, and the government and the national churches were the defendants in the court case. So our TRC came out of what became an out-of-court settlement, and it was one of the critical terms of settlement. It was not the only term of settlement. So issues to do with financial compensation were separate provisions. Issues to do with an apology, which we did have, was a separate provision. Issues to do with money for healing was a separate provision. Issues to do with commemoration and public markings, a separate provision. Ours was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and because we had nothing to do with money or compensation, everyone who participated in it did so on a voluntary basis, and they came forward because they felt they had something that they wanted to teach the country or something that they wanted to unburden themselves from, very often secrets that they had been holding for 50, 60 years sometimes. Our TRC had 3 primary tasks, and we had many specific duties under these 3, but these were the 3 core responsibilities. The first was to research and document both the history, referred to in our mandate as the truth, but also the legacy of residential schools. So it was not just what happened in the past, but what impact has it had on the present? The history and the legacy of IRS means Indian residential schools in our settlement. The second, a huge job. We had the job of educating Canada about the impact of the schools, the impact on many generations, and how those schools relate to the challenges in our society today. And what that's talking about is the societies where our Indigenous peoples have the highest crime rates, the highest incarceration rates, the highest mortality rates, the highest suicide rates, the highest unemployment rates, the highest poor housing rates, all of those negative statistics. And so it was to be able to explore how do those things relate to the extent that they do. The third, very important, was to inspire ongoing reconciliation and healing. And we heard in presentations this morning, and I want to acknowledge all of the previous presenters. I think everyone brought really important contributions to this wider conversation. But ours really talked about reconciliation as an ongoing, in other words, beyond the life of our commission, reconciliation, it said within our mandate, was an ongoing individual and collective process. And it was to involve former students and their families, understanding the intergenerational impacts, involving the government, involving the churches. In our Canadian context, the churches ran the schools. It sounds like the Norwegian example with the Tatar, that they ran the schools on contract to the government. But also involving, it said right in our mandate, the people of Canada. The people of Canada. So an expectation that the reconciliation would be ongoing, that it would be individual, that it would be collective, and that it would involve not just those directly affected by something, but the government that created the state policies, the churches that implemented them, and the people of Canada who are the citizens responsible for the governments of today. We made a very important decision early on, we commissioners, that we needed to keep the survivors at the heart of our work. And for those of you who know Chief Littlechild, you'll see in the front row with his hat there, he also sat on the Survivors Advisory Committee because he also went to one of the residential schools actually went to more than one. I'll speak about this again later, but in terms of our commission complement, it was very interesting that one was actually a former residential school student. Our chair was the child of former residential school students, and myself am the spouse of a former student, and obviously the parent and grandparent of intergenerational survivors. So we had an interesting range of perspective within our commission in terms of the issue. It has already been said that the hearing from people who have lived the experiences is the most powerful thing. Eduardo talked about that. I could not agree more. It was in all of the things we did, and I don't have time to tell you what all we did, but it is clear that hearing firsthand the experiences of people who lived them had the greatest impact. And we had people who were former ministers of the departments responsible, former prime ministers, former advocates who said, I thought I knew about these things. Historians, academics, they said it was only when they heard firsthand from those who had lived the experiences that they truly began to understand the depth of the harms and the degree of work that needs to be done to set things right. So you can see there, this in terms of our hearings, we actually were in more than 300 communities, but we held formal hearings in 77. Then we had 7 major national events. These were 4-day-long events, very visible, highly covered in the media, tens of thousands of people who came to those events. And we recorded for posterity 7,000 statements over the course of our mandate. We had a 5-year mandate. It was extended to 6.5 for reasons of a technicality, which I can tell someone about in the break if you're interested. But the part that was actually statement gathering, that preoccupied about 3.5 years of that time. The response, because it was loud and noisy and visible, and I would say colorful and very uplifting and profound, was incredible. We had enormous resurrection of traditional practices. This was a West Coast traditional welcome here. We had people from all walks of society, business, governments, the arts, ballet, musicians, filmmakers come forward and make expressions of reconciliation, which was really their public promise to do something differently. So we had governments come forward, for example, and say, we pledge that we are going to write and create new curriculum, and we are going to start teaching about this in our schools. We had one of our national ballets commission a dance that was about residential schools, because it said people who come to ballet are not people who would normally know about these things. So we wanted to bring the issue to places where people would discover something that they hadn't known before. There were many examples, but that's just to give you a couple. Even hockey in Canada, you know how big hockey is in your part of the world, it is in Canada as well. A number of our national hockey games had our national anthem sung in Indigenous languages for the first time at the beginning of games, and so on. People did what they could. We had, and this is very important to tell you, over the course of our 7 national events, you see we were very intentional in giving them traditional themes so that each national event could contribute towards our 3 big goals: capturing the truth, public statement gathering, educating the country, and that included educating many Indigenous children who didn't know what had happened in their families, did not know why things were the way they were, but knew something was not right. But also educating wider population. And then the third thing, inspiring reconciliation. So we tried to create moments, public moments, where people could make these declarations so that others could learn. Anyway, one of the things we did was choose themes that were Indigenous teachings about respect, courage, love, truth, humility, honesty, and wisdom. Very importantly, when we began our work, about 10% of the people who came were non-Indigenous. And my cynical self thought that would drop off. What actually happened over the course of our work, by the time we did that 7th event, 60% of the people who participated were non-Indigenous. It was an actual measure of the awakening that had been going on as people came to realize this is something, if this had been my child, appealing to the universal, if this had been my child, how would I have borne that? And to realize that if it was not right for one group of people, it was also not right for another group of people. And therefore to come forward and say, we need to make this right. And that's what we saw happen. Just some of what we heard, just to give you an idea, because this is in the context of residential schools, but it may be the sort of thing one could expect to hear in the context of any kind of perceived harm. I hated being an Indian, that was the phrase used, and I was made to feel ashamed of my parents. I want my identity back. Is that too much to ask? I believe in elders. I found my identity through my culture. Now I have to make things right with my children so that they can learn and so that they can tell their children they care. An inability to parent well and to express affection for children by those who had been raised in institutions without those experiences. If this history, our history, was shared in the education system, we'd build our self-esteem back to what it once was. And this was really around the issue, very rampant in Canada, but I know it's not unique to our country. Very high rates of addictions and alcoholism and other kinds of self-medication. That's how people described it to us. Self-medication from the harms and traumas of the past. And this very important one, by listening to your story, my story can change. By listening to your story, I can change. And this speaks to the point that was raised by Simon about transformation. And yes, that is a big stretch. But we did not go out with that word in mind. We heard that word. We heard people say it to us over and over again. The experience of being together here has been transformative, and hearing from directly from the residential school survivors. So then to move on to the second part, and I'm very conscious that we're tight for time here, so I'll try to move quickly, but some of these points have been raised already. About truth commissions, some of the things that I've reflected on. This is not an exhaustive list, but the question of motivation, why? Why are we holding this? And is it a shared motivation? Is it political, to gain some kind of points or to get somebody off your back about something? Is it legal because there's a law that has been breached? Is it emotional? Is it an issue of recognized social justice? Is there international pressure and the country is trying to avoid its own international black eye? I'm not saying it's any of those things, but I think a lot of times it's a combination of those things. In our case in Canada, it's fair to say that it was not a political initiative. It was legally obligated, and within the parties to the settlement agreement, there were those who were passionate about we must have a truth commission, and there were others who did not want to have one. And in the end, because it was a court case, it became a kind of breaking point, and it for survivors became the most important thing because they wanted a chance for their voice to be heard and for their side of history to be known and to be documented. The issue of the mandate and the authority of TRC, and these are two different things. One is what public institution or mechanism or private for that matter, whatever, what is the instrument that will be used to allocate resources and monies and basically sanction the thing, but also who determines the authorities that will be given. So in our case, it was the courts who determined, but it was our federal government that had to actually provide the monies and the means. And so we were sworn in as an order in council by our federal government to have our powers as a commission. But the powers gave us independence. We were not sworn in by the government to become agents of government. We were sworn in to be independent commissioners working for the survivors. That's how we saw it. And in our court settlement, it was the court-ordered monies that paid for our commission. And that was a very highly debatable point because the government always wanted to say, well, we created the Truth Commission. But the truth is that they created it despite themselves. They had to because the court said they had to. So just understanding where it comes from, what right do you have to do these things? That becomes a question that you have to be able to answer. And in our case, and I might even suggest ideally, but I don't know, a multi-party negotiation allows for there to be a shared understanding of what is it we're trying to do and why are we trying to do it and how are we trying to do it. The legal powers and the independence of the commission. Ours was post-judicial, as Eduardo said. Some commissions are quasi-judicial and they require sworn testimony and all of that. South Africa had powers of subpoena. You could subpoena people to come. Ours was entirely voluntary. And I liked that about ours because for me, it reassured me. Since we had no money to give anyone and we had not forced anyone to speak, there was no reason for us to doubt the truth of what they were saying. There was nothing in it for them except a lot of hard work to sort of speak truth about things that were very difficult. Questions of amnesty, if there are judicial authorities, that's an issue that comes up. We had none of that. And as I already explained, we had no financial compensation issues. On the matter of commissioners, it's probably one of the most common questions I got over the life of the commission. How did I get to be a commissioner? Or who chose me? So we were not appointed as such. The wording that gets used is appointed because it was an appointment. Mechanically, it was an appointment process. There had to be paperwork, there had to be swearing in, there had to be signing off. But in terms of how we were selected, I always say to people most simply, I applied for the job. There was a website that was already established explaining what is it we're trying to do here, explaining what the broad roles of the commissioners would be, and the kinds of qualifications they would need, the kinds of experiences they would expect. And I applied for the job, and so did apparently 300 or 400 other people, and was lucky enough to be selected. This issue becomes really important because one thing I'll just tell you briefly is in Canada, there were 3 commissioners before us, and it didn't work. It didn't work. They didn't last a year. We were the second coming, I like to say. But we therefore were very determined to stand together and to work together, and we made a lot of effort to communicate to people that we were going to see it through, that we were going to stick together, which does not mean we didn't have lots of challenges. We had tons of challenges, but we made a promise, we made a pledge to each other that we would stick together. One of us was a lawyer, is a lawyer with a lot of international human rights background. One of us was a judge, and who had overseen commissions before. My background was as a longtime journalist and a former teacher. So we had a different range of technical skills, some of them overlapping, but the ability to wade through complex information and to zero in on the heart of the matter. I think those are essential skills. The ability to communicate clearly, the ability to have a thick skin, because there is never going to be a time in any aspect of a commission where everybody agrees with everything. So you have to have a thick skin and be able to hear criticism without being devastated by it, and without being daunted by it. You have to be able to carry on. Issues of indigeneity. In our case in Canada, because it was a multi-party negotiation, the state and Indigenous peoples, it seemed valuable to those deciding that there would be Indigenous and non-Indigenous people involved. My 2 colleagues are from southern Canada. Ironically, though I'm non-Indigenous, I live in the most northerly, isolated parts of the country. So we brought a geographic range, a gender balance, a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, And in my case, I'm also fluently functional in French, which in Canada is very important, that someone be able to do that, because there were also residential schools in Quebec, and you may know about the French facts in Canada. Strong ability to exercise diplomacy. You're dealing with people who are in many ways broken, spiritually wounded, and you have to be able to hear that with care, and to listen with empathy, and at the same time to hold strong when you're resisting or facing opposition. You have to be able to model reconciliation in your own functioning. No matter what you may have to deal with internally, that's the image that needs to go out there. And I'll just say right now we have a different commission happening in Canada, and it is struggling very much, in part over its seeming challenge at holding itself together as commissioners, and also holding its staff to commitment to the task. They've had enormous turnover, and it's very destabilizing for them, and it's very compromising in terms of the credibility of the commission. So getting that part right is really vital, and getting everyone to agree with it. We were, by the way, when I say I was hired for the job, it was a selection committee of, I think it was 12 people, representing all the parties to our settlement agreement. So First Nations represent, not representative, the head of the First Nations of Canada, the head of the Inuit of Canada, the head of a representative of the Protestant churches, a representative of the Catholic churches, the government of Canada, and legal representation for the survivors. That was the delegation that selected the commissioners. We've heard a lot about the scope already. I'll just tell you on that, I don't have an opinion whether it's narrow or broad, but you have to decide that. Is it a generalized grievance or is it a specific thing? What I can tell you about ours, it was specific. It was about residential schools. But in the context of our work, people talked about all kinds of things, and it was partly because of the way we conducted it. So we asked people in a very undirected way, what was life like before residential schools? What was your experience at the schools? What has life been like for you after the schools? And what would reconciliation look like to you? We've heard a lot this morning about what is reconciliation? Is it this? Is it that? Is it something else? I don't think there's one answer, and I don't think there has to be one answer. I think it's many things. I think it's individual. I think it is also collective. But what we did was not try to force our own interpretation, but rather ask people what it would mean to them, and then try to sift through that to find our own gauge of what it was in a kind of general way. We ended up concluding for us the general notion of reconciliation is the establishment and maintaining of respectful relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Assuming, first of all, that in many cases there is no relationship, so you have to establish it. That's one of the problems that we often face, is we're dealing with strangers in our own countries. So you have to establish the relationship, you have to maintain it between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And so that's what I would say about the scope. But when people came forward, they're talking about the schools. What would reconciliation mean to them? We heard about everything from clean water to drink, affordable housing, any housing that's not moldy, the ability to speak their language, the ability to walk down the street without having racist comments thrown at them, the ability to have a good relationship with their child, where those had been broken in many cases, availability of treatment facilities for drug and alcohol addiction. People answered it widely. What would reconciliation look like to you? And some people did say, as we heard Simon mention, reconciliation begins with me, learning to love myself, rather than believing all of the negative things about myself that I was told growing up. Time frame. whatever your time frame is, think it through carefully. It takes time to form a commissioner team. If you want it to work well together, that takes time. The trust building also has to be among the commissioners, to build staff, to develop a work plan, and that includes, very importantly, a really good communication strategy so that your team knows what you're doing and so that the society knows what you're doing, including your various communities within that. Time to consult and to act with cultural sensitivity and respect. A lot has already been said about that, but I just underscore it. And then time to, this is very important, and I thank Eduardo and his team previously at the International Center for Transitional Justice. That expert seminar on truth commissions and access to justice, which I was part of, very important point made that something that cripples many truth commissions, they submit their report in the final breath of their mandate, and then they go away exhausted and no one pays any attention to it. Really important that your time frame allows for you to issue your report and your conclusions, your calls to action, and that you still have some gas in the engine left to go out and tell people about it, to explain what you mean, to tell them where they fit in, and to help people own it and share it and feel included in it. That's really, really important. Resources, it depends how you want to do it, but if you're going to engage people, that takes space, that takes travel often, that sometimes takes accommodation, sometimes it takes special venues. You have to think carefully about that. Staffing. If everyone is borrowed from a government department or somewhere else, do they have allegiance to this? Is this an assignment they're happy about, or is this an assignment that they are frustrated about, they feel they're being punished to do? Do you have a proper balance of people in the staff? Do you have the right skill set? If you're hiring people just because they are from this or that group, but they don't have skills to bring to a very demanding job, then you may be setting yourself up for failure in that way. And then remembering too that the process of working together is its own reconciliation opportunity, because many people have never worked together before, at least in our Canadian context. So then, the other thing is, I think, to think about protections for staff. If you're going to have an honest commission and not one where you already have predetermined what you want the result to be, then staff have to feel safe that if they're part of something and there's any part of their conclusion that's controversial, that they're not going to be blacklisted from future career opportunities. That sounds very specific, but it's a thing that came up in our commission. Cultural safety, there's so much that could be said about that, but I simply want to say this. The first year of our life as a commission, we went around, we didn't do any hearings. We did public speaking, explaining to communities what the settlement agreement said, what our commission was, and what we were going to be expected to do, and letting them know so that they could get ready. At the same time, and this was not our responsibility, it was the government's responsibility as part of the settlement, a whole group of health supports were also getting ready. Western-trained social workers, psychotherapists, doctors, nurses, and so on, and cultural support people, spiritual leaders within the Indigenous tradition, cultural knowledge keepers. And for the first time in the history of our country, they created integrated teams and they worked together. And that too was a process of reconciliation in a professional context. And so by the time that first year was done, when we actually started our hearings, we had really qualified health support, integrated health support teams. And many of the health support people were former residential school students themselves, so they understood, but they were far enough along in their own healing that they could contribute well. And in our case, we also had spiritual advisors. That's a very personal decision by our commissioners, but each of us had our own spiritual advisor so that we could stay strong in the face of really difficult work. I'm aware of the time here, and I should wrap it up quickly, right? Seems to me. I want to just address these two other points, and then I'm going to speed through to the conclusion. Documentation, it was a huge issue for us. You're going to be documenting your work. Who owns that? Who controls it? Who controls access to it? What is the degree of privacy? When people are speaking to you, we had contracts, basically contracts that they had to sign to let us know, do I want my statement to be private? Can you use the content but not my name? Can you use the content but not my picture? Can you use just the audio but not the visual? Or can you use all of it? Because some people just wanted a place to talk because they needed that for their own healing. Some people very much wanted to contribute to the educational goals. So know that ahead of time, but then know who's going to keep the archives. And I say that because in Canada there was a huge issue around destruction of records once all of this was over, and we had to go back to court to fight that. So think about that. I'm going to skip over the issue of accountability, except for the last bullet. Who is responsible to act on the conclusions and recommended actions? We chose very intentionally to target we called them calls to action. We didn't want to say recommendation because it sounded optional. We wanted it to sound urgent and essential. We targeted many to the government, for sure, the federal government, but many to our provincial governments, many to our municipal governments, some to the Indigenous organizations and leadership, some to schools, some to the sports and athletic organizations, some to the media. We made it plain through our calls to action that there was work to be done throughout society, and we were specific in that way. And then this last point that I'll just say, and we didn't know it at the time, but I think it's something, if I were doing it again, I would advocate for more strongly. We didn't make any provision for life after the commission for the commissioners, either for the kind of latent reclaiming of your health and well-being. You're hearing a lot of traumatic things, and there's a need for aftercare. But the other is a very practical one. The demand for people to know about what you've done, the work you've done, and so on. We made no provision for that, and I think we should have maintained a small secretariat. So lessons learned, just spinning through that very fast. I think there's huge danger in doing nothing. We talked about the importance of education as being key in all sectors of society, because part of the reason we get in these situations is because we live in isolation of each other, and there is huge ignorance between us about each other. And that's the Canadian context in any case. Maybe that's because our geography is so big and we're so spread out. But we really believe in that. And then, because you have to believe in this, I certainly do. Believe in the fundamental goodness of everyone. Believe in the goodness of everyone, rather than believing in the deep cynicism of everyone. And that means that if you I never once experienced telling what happened at the residential schools to any non-Indigenous person without them saying, that is not right, that should not have happened. But people didn't know. They didn't know it was happening. And so I think if people know, then their attitudes can change. And if their attitudes can change, then actions can change. And that's kind of the sequence there. This is just talking about education. I'm just going to, these are online, they're available, but I'll just tell you that we concluded with 94 calls to action. And what's important about those, they are available online. The first bundle of them are legacy calls to action. I sometimes refer to those as cleaning up the mess. And then the other bundle are about reconciliation, which is creating a new reality. So some of them are reparative, if I can put it that way, and the others are restorative and reconciliatory. about new possibilities. But underlying all of those calls to action, we had principles. And this is what we've been talking about as we go around the country now, telling people when they say, well, what can we do? What can we do? We say, think about the principles that underlie your work. And the first of these is to do with the UN Declaration. I do believe Finland is a signatory to that. So important that those working in these issues are well aware of what those provisions for the UN Declaration say about land rights, about water rights, about cultural rights, about language rights, educational rights, and the ability to raise your own children, among other things, the ability to determine your own membership. All of these things are covered in the UN Declaration. So if you're a signatory as a state, what does that mean in your practical policy implementation and your practical local legislation and so on? And so we have said that the UN Declaration is like a framework for reconciliation in our Canadian context, and perhaps it is for you. The second is the principle that we have treaty obligations. We have constitutional protections. So in other words, we have to follow our own laws. We have laws, we have to follow them. That's what that really is saying. The third is it's about relationships. It's not just about relations. It's about relationships, and it's hard to build trust with strangers. How do you build trust with people you don't know? And I don't presume to know how you're organized in Finnish society, but I know in Canada we've been perfectly structured to not know each other for all these 150 years of our country. And we have to build relationships in order to build trust. I see my numbers are wonky here, I'm sorry. The second three there, that's about those legacy things that I've told you, and it's not just because it's a nice thing to do, it's because there are huge disparities in our society, and they're measurable, and we need to use that as a principle that things should get better. The next one picks up on that very point. The sixth one, very important, is that we think about treaties in Canada as being for Indigenous people. But it's like a marriage contract. Two people get married, not just the one person. And so this is a recognition that we're all treaty peoples. Even though we've never been taught about the treaties or been expected to know them, that has to change because they were signed on our behalf by our public governments. And we're all treaty peoples, and we share that responsibility. The role of elders and traditional knowledge keepers, I've talked about that already. But if you ask, for instance, the issue of reconciliation, someone mentioned this early this morning, we tried to get people to say, what does reconciliation mean in your Indigenous language? Extremely varied. But one of the ones from home that I love is so powerful. It means to become two again. Not one instead of the other, not one on top of the other, not one ahead of the other, to become two again. And I think the concept of it is really very beautiful, and it comes from that traditional teaching. Issues of language and traditional knowledge systems and protocols and connection to land, these are all defining things. People didn't talk about, I'm from this or that place. They talked about their relationship to land, their traditional lifestyles in their quest for reclaiming of identity. And then this one I'm going to skip over, number 9, because I conclude with that. And then the need for ongoing public education and dialogue. Very importantly, youth engagement, because most young people have no idea either how things were before or what happened and how things changed so dramatically. And that includes Indigenous youth. It would be very wrong to assume Indigenous people know all about these things and non-Indigenous people don't. That's not the reality in Canada for reasons of all the displacements. So conclusions, it needs political commitment. And we started off, we changed governments. We had quite a resistant government when the whole matter was before the courts and not wanting to have a truth commission and so on. We have a different government now in the implementation phase. We have to see whether the implementation is truthful or is legitimate, but that's the intention. And we have our Prime Minister on record saying no relationship is more important than the one with Indigenous peoples. He gave in his mandate letter to every single one of his ministers an obligation to do their part in fulfilling the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so that's hugely important. And the other conclusion I would say is, in our context, very important to confirm that reconciliation also needs public commitment. The us and they kind of language that gets used too often in Canada, that has to become an understanding this is not an Indigenous problem, this is not Indigenous history. In our case, this was Canadian history as a result of Canadian laws and Canadian policies that affected a particular group of people in a particular way. And so it belongs to Canadians to redress laws, to redress policies, and to redress dealings with each other, both through our institutions and through our everyday engagement. Just to tell you who these people are, we have one of our former prime ministers there. We have one of our national auditors general. We have the head of our Human Rights Commission. We have a survivor from Buchenwald who saw himself as a survivor in solidarity because he too was a child in an institutionalized setting beyond his control. We have similar representation from a Rwandan genocide survivor. One of our national broadcasters is there, and indeed one of our former ministers of Indian Affairs. This is just a sampling. We have 75 such people, very prominent people, who committed publicly that they would use their offices and their profile to advance understanding of reconciliation so that it could be an ongoing process. And that was a hugely important part of our work. So my final thought, and we'll skip the video, reconciliation is not a thing, it's something that grows, and it grows out of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership, cooperation, and commitment. And that includes internal leadership. Lots of room for fractions and such within government, within Indigenous organizations, among Indigenous organizations. It needs leadership of everyone and cooperation and commitment. It requires sustained action from all those sectors. Don't give up, as I say, don't get tired. This takes stamina and takes ongoing effort. It is an ongoing process. And we remember in Canada, we always say it's for the sake of the 7 generations, knowing that what we decide today has a huge bearing on our children and their children and so on. And a friend of mine who is Canadian Indigenous, but whose father is Finnish, who refers to herself as a Findian, said, talk to them about the spirit of Sugu. It's something that they will understand, because that's what it takes, is deep courage and stamina and determination and goodwill. So I wish you all of those things, and thank you very much for this opportunity.